I've always been fascinated by conspiracy theories and stories about Area 51. When I was offered a job doing psychological stress testing at a remote facility, I didn't think twice. The pay was excellent, and the contract promised a short term. But there was a strange clause. No one was allowed to talk about what happened during the tests. I thought this was just standard precautions for military projects until I arrived at the site. It was a white, windowless room, lit by cold, harsh lights. A camera was attached to the upper corner of the wall, always pointed at me. "All you have to do is stay in the room for 48 hours while we monitor your reactions," explained the supervisor, a man in a gray suit and sunglasses. His face betrayed no emotion. "There's nothing to worry about." The first day was uneventful. They gave me water, food, and a small mattress to rest on. I spent the time pacing back and forth, trying to keep myself occupied. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. But at night, the silence was broken. I was lying on my mattress when I heard a low sound, like a distant whisper. I sat up, trying to identify where it was coming from. The sound was inside the walls. "Can you hear me?" the voice whispered, soft, almost gentle. I stood up quickly, my eyes fixed on the camera. "Is this some kind of hearing test?" I asked, but no one answered. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone were behind me. "Pay attention," the voice said again, cold and mesmerizing. I looked around, trying to remain calm. The room was empty, just like before, but the feeling of not being alone was suffocating. The buzzing of the lights grew louder, almost like a pressure in my ears. Then the clock stopped. The digital display, which marked the remaining hours of the test, froze at 2:47, and at that moment, the air grew heavier. The camera on the wall slowly turned, pointing directly at me, as if it were observing me more closely. "The test never ends," the voice whispered one last time before disappearing. I knocked on the metal door, demanding an answer. "Is this part of the experiment? Can anyone hear me?" Silence was the only response. That's when I realized that the clock, which had previously stopped, was now running backwards. The clock ticked backwards, each second marked by a dry, metallic sound, echoing in the empty room. The air grew thick, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The buzzing of the lights was louder, almost unbearable, as if pressing on my ears. "The test never ends," the voice repeated, this time closer, almost beside me. "Who's there?" I shouted, turning towards the wall, where the sound seemed to be originating. There was no one, but the shadow of the camera on the wall was different. It seemed larger now, more elongated, as if something were hiding behind it. The clock continued to count backwards, speeding up with each second. I tried to remain calm, but the environment seemed to be changing. The walls were closer, as if the room were slowly contracting. "Is this part of the test?" I asked, staring at the camera. No answer. It was then that the lights flickered. In the split second that the room went dark, I saw a figure in the corner. It was tall, thin, and covered in a kind of fluid shadow. It had no face, just a smooth, dark surface. "It's almost time," the voice said, now deeper and distorted. The lights came back on, and the figure disappeared, but the clock was still counting down, now at an insane speed. The display flashed numbers that made no sense, until suddenly, it stopped again. 0000. The room fell into complete silence. The buzzing of the lights stopped, and the air seemed to turn freezing. The blank display reflected my face, but something was wrong. My reflection blinked. I took a step back, my heart racing, while the reflection remained still, watching me with a smile that shouldn't have been there. The metal door opened with a long creak, revealing a dark, narrow hallway. There was no more buzzing, no more voices, just absolute silence. I picked up my backpack from the corner and took a few steps toward the exit. Looking back one last time, the room was empty, but the camera was still turned toward me, as if it were following me to the door. As I walked down the hallway, A dim light appeared at the end, along with the sound of heavy footsteps. I hurried forward, trying not to look to the sides, but there were shadows moving all along the way, tall, distorted figures that seemed to be following me. Finally, I reached the exit. The supervisor was there, waiting for me. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes were fixed on me in a way that made me feel small. "Congratulations, you passed the test," he said calmly, reaching out to shake my hand. "You can go home now." I didn't say anything. I just walked out, my heart still pounding. Since that day, I've never been the same. At first, it was just a feeling of being watched. Then came the voices, always at night, when everything was quiet. And every time I look at a clock, I see the hands turning backwards, always at 2:47, because the test never ended. I had been working at Area 51 for 3 months when I was given a new assignment, to inspect the underground wing, they said. I thought that was odd, since this area had never been mentioned before. The base had its secrets, but we all knew that certain parts were completely off limits, and the deepest level was one of those places. "This is just a routine check," my supervisor explained. "Don't touch anything, and most importantly, don't enter the room marked Room 7. That should have been enough of a warning to make me suspicious, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the narrow hallways, lit by a cold, pale light. The air was thick and carried a metallic smell, mixed with something indefinable but unpleasant. After descending 3 flights of stairs, I found a steel door marked Underground Level 4. It slowly opened, revealing a long, silent hallway. There were several doors lined up, each with numbers painted in red. 1, 2, 3, until finally, at the end of the hallway, I saw the door marked Room 7. My breath caught in my chest. Something about this place felt wrong. The silence wasn't normal. It was the kind of silence that screams, that weighs on you like an invisible presence. I walked past the other doors, trying to ignore my curiosity, but when I reached Room 7, I couldn't move. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a dim light inside. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered from inside. My heart raced. I took a step back, trying to stay calm, but something was calling me inside. Against all instinct, I pushed the door open slowly. The room was small and empty, with bare concrete walls. In the center, there was only a metal chair facing the wall. The smell in there was stronger, a mix of rust and something rotten. Before I could react, the door closed by itself with a bang. "Sit down," said the voice again, this time closer, almost next to me. "Sit down." The voice sounded both close and distant at the same time, as if it were inside my head. The air in Room 7 was so thick that breathing seemed impossible. My eyes were fixed on the chair in the center of the room. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. "I shouldn't be here," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my pounding heart. I took a step toward the door, but it didn't move. It was as if the entire room was alive, trapping me there. Suddenly, the room began to change. The lights flickered, and for a brief second, I saw something reflected in the concrete walls. My own silhouette, but distorted. It was taller, with arms that were too long, and its head tilted at an impossible angle. When the lights stabilized, the chair was occupied. A figure sat in it. It was shaped like a man, but its skin was gray and shiny, as if it wasn't really flesh. He had no eyes, just black sockets that seemed to suck the light out of the room. His mouth was open in a smile that was too wide. "Sit with me," he said, his voice cold and metallic. My feet felt glued to the floor. I tried to look away, but his eyes, or lack thereof, pulled me like a magnet. He slowly raised a skeletal finger and pointed at me. "You called me. Now I'm here." I didn't do anything," I shouted, my voice shaking. The figure rose from the chair with slow, inhuman movements. His joints creaked, as if his body was not used to moving. He began to approach, and the metallic smell in the air became unbearable. Without thinking, I ran to the door and began pounding on it desperately. "Get me out of here. Please get me out of here." I heard footsteps on the other side. Someone was there. "Open the door," I shouted. But before the door opened, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the hallway outside room 7. My head was pounding, and my vision was blurry. The door was closed again, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. The overseer stood there, staring at me with his arms crossed. He didn't look surprised. In fact, his face was calm, almost indifferent. "You came in, didn't you?" he said, his voice steady. I heard something in there," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. "Everyone hears it," he said simply, "but not everyone leaves." Before I could say anything else, he pulled me away from the door. "Forget what you saw. You won't talk about it to anyone. Now go." I left Area 51 that night, but something followed me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I see a long shadow in the corner of my room, even though there's no one there. Sometimes I feel a cold hand on my shoulder, always at night. And every now and then, I hear that voice again, cold and metallic. "Sit with me, just one more time." Room 7 never let me go completely. I've never been one to believe in conspiracy theories, but that trip to the Nevada desert would change my life forever. I was driving home from a friend in Las Vegas late at night on a deserted road that cut through the area near Area 51. The GPS showed me a shortcut that would save me almost an hour of travel. The road was lonely, with no cell phone signal, but it seemed peaceful. After a few minutes, the car's headlights illuminated a figure in the middle of the road. I stopped abruptly, my heart racing. A man was standing there on the asphalt, looking directly at me. He didn't move or even blink. I thought it might be someone lost, so I rolled down the window and asked, "Are you okay?" No answer. He just stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on mine. Something was wrong. The man was dressed in regular clothes, but his face looked wrong. The features were slightly distorted, as if someone had tried to copy them, but didn't know exactly what a human face should look like. I decided to keep going, swerving slowly so as not to run him over. As I passed him, the rearview mirror reflected something that made my blood run cold. The man was still standing, but now he was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile. I sped up, trying to get away as quickly as possible. After a few minutes, I looked in the rearview mirror again. The road was empty, or at least I thought it was. It was then that the car radio turned on by itself, emitting a static noise. A low, metallic voice emerged amidst the static, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You can't run away." I looked back at the road, and my heart almost stopped. The man was there, again, standing in the middle of the road. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, other figures slowly emerged from the darkness, all with the same twisted smile, their eyes shining in the headlights. The figures remained still on the road, their eyes fixed on me. Each of them wore the same smile, wide and unnatural, as if their faces were malformed masks. The air inside the car grew heavy, the metallic smell invading my nostrils again. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, trying to remain calm. The only thing I could do was accelerate. The car roared as I stepped on the accelerator. The figures fell behind, shrinking into the darkness, but for some reason, their smiles remained visible, even when their bodies were no longer in sight. I drove at full speed, my eyes fixed on the road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror again. Adrenaline coursed through my blood, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then, the radio crackled again. The same metallic voice spoke, this time clearer. "You can't escape. They're with you." The car began to lose power. The engine coughed and sputtered, until the vehicle finally died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The only light came from the headlights, illuminating a narrow stretch of road ahead. I sat there, trying to start the car again. Nothing. Total silence. Then I heard the footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from outside. I swallowed hard, trying not to panic. I looked to the side and saw a shadow moving around the car, slowly, as if it were surrounding me. "Get out," said the voice, now outside, soft and menacing. I didn't move. My eyes were fixed on the window glass. It was then that, for a brief second, I saw the reflection of a deformed face looking at me through the glass, smiling eerily. The car's lights flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, they were there again, all around the vehicle, watching in silence. I blinked, and the glass was covered in handprints, as if dozens of people were trying to get in. Without thinking twice, I locked the doors and closed my eyes, waiting for it all to pass. The footsteps continued, the low laughter echoing around me. The smell of rust became unbearable. Suddenly, silence returned. The radio turned off, and the air became light again. I slowly opened my eyes and looked around. The figures had disappeared. I tried to start the car again. The engine roared, as if nothing had happened. I accelerated, leaving that place behind as quickly as possible. But the fear was still there. Since that night, I have never driven down that road again. But something followed me. Sometimes, my car radio turns on by itself, and I hear the same hissing sound as before. And when I am alone at night, I see silhouettes outside the window. They do not move, they just stand there, smiling, always smiling. They never let me go. It all started when I took a temporary job as a radio operator at an airbase near Area 51. The job seemed simple: monitor aircraft communications in flight and record any suspicious activity. Most of the time it was monotonous, just numbers and codes that needed to be filed away. Until that night. The clock read 11:47 p.m. when a strange sound came over the radio. It wasn't a normal transmission. It sounded like static mixed with something else, almost like heavy breathing. "Air traffic control, this is Flight 713, requesting clearance to land." The voice was cold, distant, as if it were coming from far away. I looked at the list of scheduled flights. There was no record of any Flight 713 that night. "Flight 713, this is the control tower. Where are you from?" There was a long pause. The radio crackled again, followed by the same cold tone. "I'm heading home." I felt a chill run down my spine. That simple sentence seemed to be loaded with something dark. I tried to locate the plane on the radar, but there was no signal, just the empty sky over the desert. "Flight 713, confirm your position. We don't have your location on the radar." Another pause, longer this time. Then the voice answered, almost whispering, "Look at the sky." I quickly left the control tower and looked up. A plane was flying in circles, high above the base. Its lights blinked slowly, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, I noticed something terrifying. The plane was flying very low and very slow, almost as if it were floating. "Flight 713, what's your destination?" I asked again, trying to control the tension in my voice. "I never arrive. I just keep flying." That answer froze me. The plane's lights flashed once more, and then, without warning, it disappeared into the dark sky, as if it had never been there. I went back to the tower, my heart pounding, and reviewed the communications logs. There was no record of any transmission from Flight 713. But when I looked at my watch again, it was stuck at 11:47 p.m., the same time the transmission had started. Before I could think of an explanation, the radio crackled again. "I'm coming back," said the same voice, and this time it sounded even closer. "I'm coming back." The voice on the radio sounded so close I could almost feel the coldness of it. I looked up at the sky again, but the plane was gone. The silence of the night was absolute, interrupted only by the low hiss of the radio, like a steady breath. I tried to stay calm, checking the monitors, but something was wrong. The radar flashed, and a red spot appeared on the screen. It moved in circles, exactly where the plane had been before, even though the sky was empty. "Flight 713, identify yourself," I insisted, sweat dripping down my forehead. The answer came almost immediately. I've been here before, and I'll be here again. My heart was pounding. The voice sounded filled with a deep sadness, as if it had been trapped in that moment forever. The radar flashed again, and now the red spot was directly above the tower. Suddenly, the lights went out. The radio still hissed, but this time it was different. There were voices mixed in with the noise, some laughing softly, others whispering words I couldn't understand. The room was dark, and the only light came from the radar screen, which showed the red dots slowly spinning in circles, getting closer and closer. Then I heard footsteps. They were light but steady, echoing through the empty hallway. I grabbed my flashlight and turned slowly, shining it into the entrance. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, now all around me, as if something invisible was surrounding me. "You've seen me before," the voice whispered behind me. I swung the flashlight quickly, but saw nothing. My heart was about to explode when I realized something terrible. The windows were covered in handprints, as if dozens of people were pressing their faces against the glass, watching me. Without a second thought, I ran to the door and left the tower. The desert air was freezing, and the feeling of being watched had never been so intense. I looked up at the sky again, and there it was, the plane, flying in slow, silent circles, its lights blinking softly. But this time, I could see something different. A shadow stood in the cockpit, motionless, watching me. The radio in my pocket crackled once more. "I'm always here," the voice said. The plane suddenly accelerated, climbing higher and higher until it disappeared into the dark sky. The next morning, I reported everything to my supervisor. He listened silently, his eyes cold and calculating. When I finished, he just smiled and said, "You found Flight 713. "But what is that?" I asked, still shaken. He shook his head, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "A flight that never reached its destination. It keeps flying, and always comes back. You were lucky to get off." Ever since that day, the radio in my car turns on by itself at 11:47 p.m., always with the same hiss, and sometimes I hear the same voice repeating that phrase, "I'm coming back." And when I look up at the sky, I see flashing lights. They never land. I've always been curious about Area 51, so when some friends invited me to take a road trip to the Nevada desert, I couldn't resist. The idea was to get as close to the fence that delimited the forbidden area as possible. Just for fun, of course. We were on a dirt road, surrounded by nothing but sand and distant mountains. The sky was clear, and the moon lit the way before us. It seemed peaceful, until we realized we were no longer alone. "What's that?" one of my friends asked, pointing to something on the horizon. A figure was standing by the side of the road, thin, tall, and motionless. It didn't look human. Even from a distance, I could see that its skin was a shiny grayish hue, reflecting the moonlight. "Someone must be messing with us," I tried to say, but my voice shook. The driver slowed down as we got closer, but the figure didn't move for a second. It seemed to be watching us, its head tilted slightly to the side. Its arms were too long, almost disproportionate to its body. When we were a few meters away, it took a step forward, revealing a face without defined features, only two large black eyes, without lids, that reflected the light like mirrors. My friend stepped on the accelerator, passing the creature as fast as he could. The car shook, and for a second, I thought we were safe. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made me freeze. The creature was running after us, and it was no ordinary run. Its movements were fast, almost impossible, as if it were sliding on the ground. "Accelerate," I shouted, panic taking over me. The speedometer went past 100 kilometers per hour, but the creature did not slow down. It was getting closer and closer, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its face expressionless, but disturbing. Suddenly, it disappeared. The car continued down the road, silence filling the space again. Everyone in the car was gasping for breath, not understanding what had just happened. "Did it go away?" someone asked, still looking out the window. Before I could answer, the car shook violently, as if something had fallen on it. The roof caved in slightly, and the sound of nails scraping against metal echoed above our heads. "It's on the roof," I screamed, panic taking over. The sound of the claws scratching the roof of the car was unbearable, as if it were tearing through the metal. The driver accelerated even more, but the creature was still there, unwavering, each movement shaking the car. The roof gave way a little more, as if something heavy was about to break through. "She's going in," someone in the back seat shouted. Panic spread. My eyes were fixed on the sunken roof, waiting for the moment when the creature would finally break through. The car roared through the desert, dust rising around us, but there was nowhere to go. Then everything went silent. The car stabilized, and the scratching stopped abruptly. We stood in shock for a few seconds, breathing heavily, and fear still pulsing in our chests. "She is gone," the driver whispered, slowing down. I looked out the window, trying to see anything outside. The road was empty, but the air seemed thicker, charged with electricity. Something wasn't right. "Don't stop the car," I said, trying to stay calm. But it was too late. The car began to lose speed, as if the engine was dying on its own. The speedometer dropped to 0, and the car stopped in the middle of nowhere, enveloped by the silence of the desert. "This isn't normal," I whispered, my heart racing. It was then that the radio turned on by itself, emitting a static noise. Among the hissing, a metallic voice appeared, repeating the same phrase several times. "Look behind you." No one moved. The air inside the car became cold, and my mind screamed not to turn. But, as if in an inevitable nightmare, my eyes slowly went to the rearview mirror. It was there. The creature was standing a few meters behind the car, its body partially illuminated by the taillights. Its black eyes shone in the darkness, fixed on mine. It didn't move, but its face was beginning to distort, a wide smile appearing where there had been no mouth. "Go, now," I yelled, tapping the driver on the shoulder. The engine sputtered, but wouldn't start. The radio continued to hiss, and the creature began to walk slowly toward us. Its footsteps made no sound, but each movement seemed closer, as if it were moving in slow motion, until suddenly, it was right next to the window. It tapped gently on the glass with a long, gray finger, its smile growing wider. "Let's go! Let's go!" I yelled. The car finally started, the engine roaring loudly. The driver accelerated, the wheels skidding in the sand as we drove away. The creature stayed behind, its smile still visible in the darkness, until it finally disappeared into the desert. We arrived in town hours later, still in silence, trying to process what had happened. No one wanted to talk about it, but that night, as I was trying to sleep, I felt something wrong. I got up to close my bedroom window, and across the street I saw a silhouette standing still, motionless, watching me. The same silhouette. Her dark eyes shone in the darkness, and the same wide smile slowly spread across her face. She has never left since. Sometimes I hear the radio turn on by itself, with the same voice repeating, "Look behind you." But now, I never look.